I never planned to walk toward the funeral tent that morning. At Ravenwood Hills Cemetery, most days passed in quiet routines, checking the irrigation valves, trimming the hedges, washing the bronze nameplates until my reflection stared faintly back at me. I kept to myself because life had already taken too much and silence was the only place that did not feel like a threat. But that morning, something felt different from the moment dawn bled into the Boston sky. The air was sharper than usual, slicing into my lungs as if warning me that the day ahead would not be kind. The low, gray clouds hung heavy, pressing down on the cemetery like an omen. A part of me considered turning around, heading back toward the maintenance shed where I could hide behind broken tools and unfinished repairs. Instead, I followed the sound of an organ. Deep, trembling notes rippled through the cold air, carrying a weight that tugged at parts of me I thought were long dead. My daughter used to love that sound, said it felt like the sky was humming. Maybe that was why my feet moved on their own, drawing me toward the massive silver-gray tent rising in the center of the cemetery. It billowed in the wind like sails of a ship refusing to sink. This was the funeral of Victoria Hale, a billionaire known across New England for her biomedical empire. I had never met her, but her name lived on research wing scholarship plaques and hospital entrances. People spoke of her the way some speak of saints, though money often has a strange way of shaping legends. From a distance, the ceremony looked like a scene from a film, rows of black chairs. A towering organ mourners dressed in somber elegance, their breaths forming clouds in the cold air. The grief felt heavy enough to taste. I should have walked away. Maintenance workers rarely belonged near ceremonies unless something needed fixing. But I couldn't move. Maybe it was the music. Maybe the strange tension in the wind. Or maybe the ache inside me, the one that had lived there since the day my daughter died, the ache that made me recognize pain even from afar. I slipped into the back of the gathering, hoping no one would notice. That was when Greg Hale stepped forward. Tall, handsome, immaculately dressed in a black tailored suit. His voice cracked as he spoke about love-lost devotion, the kind of words any grieving husband should say. But his eyes didn't match his voice. They were too calculated, too dry. There was no true devastation there, only performance. I'd seen real loss. I lived inside it every day. Whatever was on Greg Hale's face, it wasn't grief. Then I noticed something else. A tiny tremor in the casket lid. So small I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching closely. The wind gusted at that moment, rattling the fabric walls of the tent, so most people assumed it was just the weather. But I had once watched my daughter fight for breath in the wreckage of a burning cabin. I knew the difference between the movement of air and the movement of life. The pallbearers positioned themselves at the lowering straps. The organ swelled into a mournful cry that seemed to vibrate through my bones. A quiet signal passed between them. They were ready. That was when I heard it, a faint, strangled gasp. It was so soft I thought it might have come from someone crying behind me, but then it came again, a breath struggling to exist, a breath coming from the casket. The blood roared in my ears, my legs felt rooted to the ground, but my mind screamed to move. I stepped forward before I could think, pushing past a line of mourners. Greg turned sharply, placing a hand against my chest. "Step back. She's gone." His voice was no longer trembling. It was cold, clipped, almost rehearsed. But I looked past him at Victoria's face, visible beneath the half-open lid. Her lips were tinted blue. To anyone else, it might have looked like the stillness of death, but the shade was wrong. Not the gray of a body gone cold. It was the bruised blue of someone starved for oxygen, but still trying to fight their way back. My heart pounded against my ribs. No one else seemed to see it, hear it, feel it. The workers shifted, preparing to lower the casket into the ground. If they did, she would suffocate. Right in front of me, right in front of all of them, and they would never even know. Something inside me snapped. "Stop. She's not dead. Do not bury her." The organ cut off mid-note. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several people stood. Phones were lifted. Security rushed forward. Someone shouted that I was insane. Someone else yelled to drag me out. Another voice called me a maintenance worker who thought he was a doctor. I barely heard them. I saw only Greg's eyes. For the first time, his mask slipped, and behind the mask was not sorrow. It was fear. That was all I needed. I pushed past him, planting myself between the casket and the lowering straps. I heard her. I saw her chest move. The wind howled, whipping the tent walls so violently they snapped like sails in a storm. Dust flew into the air. A few people screamed. I looked down right as a tiny tear slipped from the corner of Victoria Hale's eye. It glimmered for one impossible moment before trailing across her skin. I leaned in, voice trembling. "Hang on, ma'am. I'm right here." The moment security grabbed my arms, the world around me dissolved into noise. People were shouting. Greg was yelling for order, and somewhere behind me someone cried out for the police. The tent shook as another gust of wind tore through it, but the cold that crawled across my skin came from something far deeper than the weather. 2 guards pinned my arms behind my back, forcing me several steps away from the casket. I twisted, trying to see Victoria's face again, trying to confirm that what I'd witnessed wasn't some desperate illusion born from a man who had already lost too much. But I knew what I heard. I knew what I saw. "He's unstable," Greg shouted, pointing at me like I was a threat in his immaculate world. "He has no business here. He's trespassing." His voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed, but beneath that polished exterior, I saw the crack again. Fear. It flickered behind his eyes like a flame behind dirty glass. The guards shoved me back another step, but I planted my feet. My breaths came hard sharp too fast, and for a second I felt the old panic rising, the memory of hot metal, the smell of burning seats. My daughter's faint voice calling for me as smoke swallowed the cabin. I forced the memory down. This wasn't about me. "Listen," I said, my voice scraping against my throat. "She's alive." I heard her. I saw her chest move. "You have to check. You have to give her a chance." The guard on my left muttered something under his breath about calling in backup, while the one on my right tightened his grip. To the crowd, it must have looked like a deranged man sabotaging a billionaire's funeral out of delusion or malice. And maybe if I were standing there watching myself, I would have believed it too. The world had long since decided who I was. A man shattered by grief. A man who lost his daughter in a plane fire he could not stop. A man whose wife left because she said his eyes no longer looked at the living. A man who fell apart, lost his job as an aviation safety technician, drank too much to quiet the nightmares, and eventually ended up sleeping behind a dumpster outside an abandoned restaurant for nearly 2 years. People saw all of that when they looked at me. They didn't see the long nights spent studying safety manuals, the hours of training, the instinct honed from years of detecting life in impossible conditions. They saw ashes where a man used to be. But instincts don't die. They bury themselves under grief, under shame, under silence. Yet, when they're needed, they rise. I met Greg's gaze as he stalked toward me, jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitch. "You're done here," he hissed. "Get him out." I shook my head, desperation groping for anything that could break through the barrier of disbelief surrounding me. Check her wrist. Check her breathing. Her temperature. Anything. You don't even need to touch her, just look more closely. The crowd buzzed with unease. Some whispered that I might be right. Others whispered that I needed psychiatric help. And then a new voice rose above the rest. "Wait!" It was a woman's voice, trembling but firm. I turned to see her pushing through the chairs, a short woman in her 70s with silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. Her steps were slow-weighted, not just with age, but with grief. She moved closer until she stood between Greg and the casket. "I am Margaret Hale," she said, her voice cracking slightly. Victoria's aunt. The murmurs swelled. She placed a hand on Greg's arm. If this man believes she is alive, if there's even the smallest chance. Greg pulled back sharply. "Margaret, he's delusional. He's a nobody. He's—" She cut him off with a look sharp enough to slice through his sentence. "Victoria told me things, Gregory. She told me she felt watched, controlled. She told me she was planning changes you wouldn't like. Greg stepped back, but for the first time uncertainty replaced his anger. The crowd began shifting whispers, changing tone as doubt crept into the air. A journalist held her camera higher. Two younger men stepped forward as if ready to back Margaret if she challenged Greg further. Dr. Alan Pierce, the man who had pronounced Victoria dead, approached with a smooth stride that held too much confidence for my liking, Mrs. Haley, he said gently, grief makes us see hope where none exists. I examined Victoria myself. She had no pulse. Her body was cold. There is no possibility she survived. I faced him. Did you use a Doppler? Did you check for residual reflexes? Did you test for any toxin-induced paralysis? His expression faltered, but he recovered quickly. There was no need for additional tests. The cause of death was clear. Convenient, I murmured, earning a glare from him. The guards tightened their grips, but they hesitated. Everyone did. For the first time since I shouted, the world around me slowed, softened, cracked open just enough for uncertainty to slip through. No one moved. No one breathed. Then something caught my eye. Victoria's hand. Her nails. There were thin, fresh scratches along the side of her index finger. Not the kind caused by jewelry or daily wear. The kind caused by friction, by desperation, by someone trying to claw their way out of a dark, confined space. Heat surged through my body. I pointed with my chin since my arms were still pinned. Look at her nail. That scratch wasn't there yesterday. Someone fighting death made that. Gasps spread through the front rows. Eyes widened. Dr. Pierce paled. Greg's breath hitched before he masked it with rage. Lower the casket now, he barked. We are ending this circus. I stepped forward against the guard's hold. You're not burying her while she's warm. The words sliced through the space like a blade. The wind fell silent. The organ player froze. Even the guards holding me seemed momentarily suspended their grips, slackening just enough for hope to slip through. And in the fragile stillness that followed, everyone's eyes turned toward the woman in the casket. The woman who, despite the world's certainty of her death, was still fighting to live. For a long moment, no one moved. The tent, the mourners, the organ player with his hands frozen above the keys. Even the guards holding my arms seemed suspended in a strange, breathless stillness. It was as if the world itself waited for someone to speak first, someone to claim certainty in a moment that felt increasingly uncertain. Aunt Margaret took a hesitant step toward the casket. Her voice trembled, but it carried a quiet strength that seemed to ripple through the gathering. Before we lower her, we should at least check. Greg spun toward her face, flushing a deep red that had nothing to do with grief. Margaret, enough. You're letting a stranger manipulate you. He's a groundskeeper, not a doctor. His emphasis on the word groundskeeper stung more than I expected, though I had been judged far worse in the past 2 years. Still, I kept my eyes on Victoria. You don't have to believe me, I said, addressing the crowd rather than Greg. Just look closer. Her skin isn't cold enough, her color is wrong. Check her reflexes. If I'm mistaken, I'll leave quietly. But if I'm right... I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't have to. Everyone knew what burying a living woman would mean. Dr. Alan Pierce stepped forward, straightening the collar of his coat as if preparing to deliver a lecture. There is no need for this, he said, raising his voice above the murmurs. I have already examined the body. She has no pulse, no respiration, no electrical activity. The man is grieving his own past and projecting it onto this situation. My jaw clenched. I'm not projecting anything. And you know it takes more than a quick check to rule out toxin-induced paralysis. His eyes flickered with something that looked dangerously close to panic before he masked it with professional irritation. Toxins that mimic death are extraordinarily rare and would require specialized testing. Mrs. Hale did not show any signs consistent with poisoning. Because you didn't look, I shot back. A few people gasped. Someone whispered that I was crossing a line. Maybe I was. But a woman's life was on the line. Margaret stepped closer to me, ignoring Greg's attempts to pull her back. "Tell us what to look for," she said. "If there are signs of life we missed, tell us." I nodded, breathing deeply to keep my voice steady. First, her corneal reflex. Lightly touch her eyelid, or bring your hand close to see if there's any movement, even the faintest. "This is absurd," Dr. Pierce muttered, but his voice had lost its earlier firmness. Next, I continued check for residual warmth. A body doesn't cool evenly. The chest and upper abdomen retain heat the longest. If she's been gone as long as he says, she should be cold to the touch. Margaret looked at Greg. "Let us check." He shook his head violently. "I will not allow you to desecrate her. She deserves dignity. She deserves the truth," someone shouted from the back. A ripple of agreement rolled through the tent. The guards holding me began to loosen their grips. Even they were no longer sure whose orders to follow. Dr. Pierce opened his mouth, but whatever rebuttal he had planned died when Margaret turned to him with sharp, tear-filled eyes. "Either you examine her again," she said, "or I will." His professional mask cracked completely. Sweat gathered at his brow. His jaw quivered. Slowly he reached toward Victoria, but before his fingers touched her skin I noticed something else, something that made my breath catch. "Wait," I said quietly. "Look at her nails." The crowd leaned in. Under the soft light filtering through the tent fabric, faint scratches were visible along the side of Victoria's index finger. Fresh scratches. She fought the lid. I said, my chest tightening. She scratched until she couldn't move anymore. An audible gasp swept through the mourners. Someone dropped their phone. Dr. Pierce staggered backward as if the sight physically struck him. Greg's face drained of color. For the first time since the ceremony began, pure terror flooded his expression before he masked it with an angry glare. "It's meaningless," he snapped. "She could have scratched herself before she died." "Not like that," I replied. "Those marks are fresh. If she'd been dead for hours, her muscles wouldn't have had the tension for that kind of pressure." My words seemed to crack open the thin barrier holding the crowd together. Voices rose. People demanded answers. Reporters moved through the aisles recording, whispering furiously into microphones. The organ player abandoned his seat. The pallbearers stepped back from the lowering straps. All eyes turned to the woman lying perfectly still beneath the half-open lid. Margaret reached down and touched Victoria's wrist lightly. Her hand jerked. "She's warm," she whispered. "Dear God, she's warm." The tent erupted. Greg grabbed her arm. "You're imagining things. I know what warmth feels like, Gregory." Her voice sharpened. "And she should not be warm." Dr. Pierce attempted one last defense. "This is not scientifically sound. Body temperature can be influenced by environmental conditions," I cut in. "It's 42 degrees outside. The tent isn't heated. If she were actually gone, she'd be cold by now." The guards finally stepped back from me. One of them, a younger man with anxious eyes, whispered, "What do we do?" I answered without taking my eyes off the casket. "We keep her from being buried alive." Margaret moved both hands toward Victoria now, touching her cheek, her neck, her chest. Tears filled her eyes. "She's not cold," she whispered again. "She's not cold at all." Greg lunged forward. "Stop touching her." Margaret stepped in front of the casket, shielding her niece. "You're not lowering her," she said with a tremor of steel in her voice. "Not until someone explains this." The crowd surged closer. Reporters leaned in. Even the guards looked ready to intervene if Greg tried anything reckless. I took a breath, letting the weight of the moment settle in my chest. "She's still fighting," I said. "She's fighting the only way she can, and unless we listen, unless we act right now, she'll lose." The entire tent stood in silent, trembling unity, faces pale with shock. Because now they all understood. This was no false hope, no delusion, no hallucination of a broken man. Victoria Hale was alive, and someone wanted the world to believe she wasn't. The moment Margaret declared Victoria warm, the entire tent seemed to shrink, pulling every sound, every breath, every heartbeat into a tight, fragile center around the casket. People pressed closer, some with hands over their mouths, others recording with trembling phones. Even the wind outside seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to push forward or retreat. I stepped nearer, feeling my pulse pound against my ribs like a warning and an obligation all at once. "We need to act now," I said. "If she's in a state of induced hypothermia or toxin paralysis, she has only minutes." Margaret turned to me, her face pale but determined. "Tell us what to do." This was the moment I hoped wouldn't come. The moment where whatever knowledge I carried might decide a life. I swallowed hard. "Lift her head slightly. It opens the airway and helps detect reflex breathing." Greg exploded before anyone could move. "Touch her, and I'll have every one of you sued into the ground." No one listened. The guards who once held me now moved to stand between Greg and the casket. The shift was small, but decisive. For the first time, Greg realized he no longer controlled the room. "Step aside," one guard warned him quietly. "This is bigger than you." Greg backed away slowly, but the fury boiling beneath his skin radiated like heat from a flame. I focused on Victoria. With a nod from me, two pallbearers carefully slid their hands beneath her shoulders and lifted just enough for me to slip folded fabric a thick funeral drape under her neck to elevate her head. Her face remained still, her lips blue, her forehead faintly damp from the chill, but her chest rose barely, so faintly that it might have been nothing more than imagination. But it wasn't, not this time. Margaret let out a broken sob. "She's breathing. She's really breathing." Her voice cracked emotion pouring out of her like water from a dam finally giving way. I reached into my coat pocket, fingers shaking, and pulled out a small thermal recovery vial. The crowd began whispering louder. "What is that?" "What's he doing?" someone called out. "Is that medicine?" "It's a thermogenic stimulant used in aviation emergencies," I said, raising my voice so everyone could hear. "It helps revive pilot consciousness when hypothermia shuts down normal function. If she's suffering from a paralytic agent or induced low-temperature state, this could help her system restart." Dr. Pierce barked from the side. "You cannot administer unauthorized substances. That is reckless and illegal, and burying someone alive isn't." Margaret snapped, turning toward him with eyes burning. His confidence cracked again. "We don't know she was alive," he muttered. I held up the vial. "I know the signs, and if she's still in there fighting, this could bridge the gap." The tent buzzed, tension spinning tighter and tighter, until it felt like the canvas above us could rip apart. My hands were trembling now, not from fear, but from the memory of holding my daughter's tiny hand as life slipped through my fingers. I hadn't been able to save her. I would not fail again. I uncapped the vial. The cold air hit the liquid, releasing a faint herbal chemical smell. I dipped the small cotton-tipped applicator into the solution. "Lift her chin slightly," I said softly. Margaret supported Victoria's jaw with shaking fingers. I leaned in and gently brushed the stimulant across Victoria's lips. Nothing happened. 10 seconds stretched into 20. The tent filled with ragged breathing and stifled sobs. A woman whispered, "Dear Lord." Dr. Pierce smirked faintly, already regaining his arrogance. "It's pointless. She's gone." My chest tightened. The edges of my vision blurred. I felt that old familiar grief clawing at me, whispering that I was too late again. I closed my eyes, holding the applicator to my forehead for a fraction of a second. "Come on," I whispered. "Don't give up on me." I leaned in again, brushing a second layer across her lips and the inside of her cheek. Greg shouted, "Stop him!" But no one moved. No one dared. The world narrowed into the space between my hand and her face. The crowd held its breath. I held mine. The tent seemed to fall silent. Then her chest rose, not a faint flutter this time. A deeper expansion, slight but unmistakable. I jerked back. Margaret gasped so loudly the entire tent heard it. Several mourners broke into cries of astonishment. A phone clattered to the ground as someone dropped it. Her lips twitched. The faintest pulse flickered at the side of her neck. Color, real living color, crept toward her cheeks. Dr. Pierce stumbled backward, face draining of blood. No, no, that's impossible. Victoria's fingers curled inward, then relaxed again like a hand waking from a long sleep. A broken sound escaped her throat, a soft, painful moan that echoed across the tent like a resurrection cry. People screamed. People prayed. People dropped to their knees. Margaret collapsed against the casket, sobbing uncontrollably. Victoria, sweet girl, come back to us. But the reaction that cut through everything, the reaction that froze even the wind, came from Greg. His mask shattered completely. He bolted toward the exit, pushing chairs, shoving mourners, scrambling like a man fleeing a crime scene. But the guards outside had heard the commotion. They caught him within seconds. He thrashed wildly. "Let me go! Let me go! She wasn't supposed to!" His voice broke off when one guard clamped a hand over his shoulder. Inside the tent, Victoria's eyelids fluttered. Slowly. Heavily. She opened her eyes. Her gaze, unfocused at first, then sharpened. And the first person she saw was Greg being dragged back inside. Her lips parted, her voice hoarse as sandpaper. "You tried to bury me alive." Gasps erupted in every direction. I stepped closer, swallowing hard against the knot in my throat. She turned her head toward me, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "How did you know?" I exhaled shakily. "You breathed, and I listened." The chaos around the tent felt like a storm trapped inside canvas walls. Reporters shouted questions. Mourners cried. Guards restrained Greg as he thrashed like a man cornered not by police, but by truth. Yet, in the middle of the noise, there was one sound that silenced everything inside me: Victoria's breathing. Shallow, shaky, strained, but unmistakably alive. She blinked slowly, eyelids trembling with the exhaustion of a body dragged back from the edge of death. Her gaze drifted over the crowd until it settled on Greg, who froze mid-struggle when he realized she was looking directly at him. His face twisted through a series of emotions so grotesque and rapid that it felt like watching a mask melt: shock, terror, anger. And then something darker. A realization that everything he planned had just unraveled. Victoria's lips parted, dryness cracking them slightly. "Greg," she whispered, voice hoarse and thin. He stared at her as if she were a ghost risen from the grave to accuse him. Maybe she was. A guard forced him to his knees. "Don't speak," Greg snapped at her, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. She ignored him and looked at me instead. "How long was I in there?" "Too long," I said softly, "but you held on." She closed her eyes, a tear escaping and trailing down her cheek. The crowd waited, sensing a truth ready to break open. Margaret wiped her eyes and whispered, "Tell us what happened, sweetheart." Victoria inhaled shakily, each breath scraping like broken glass inside her throat. "I didn't die," she said, her voice trembling. "I remember everything." A ripple of shock tore through the tent. Dr. Pierce paled visibly, fingers twitching at his sides. Victoria lifted a weak hand, pointing at him. "He drugged me. Paralytic. Something strong." I felt my body shutting down. I tried to speak, but I couldn't. I tried to scream, but everything locked. "She's delirious," Dr. Pierce barked, stepping forward. "The brain can create false memories under trauma." Margaret turned on him. "False memories. She just came back from a premature burial caused by your signature." Reporters swarmed closer, microphones thrust forward. Victoria coughed weakly, then whispered, "I heard you, both of you, arguing." Every eye turned to Greg and Dr. Pierce. "The night before I died," she continued, "I heard Greg telling him to make it look natural, to sign the paperwork, to get it over with before the divorce went public." Gasps erupted. "Divorce," someone whispered. Greg's lips curled into a snarl. "You were ruining everything," he snapped before catching himself too late. The guards stiffened. The crowd roared. Victoria's voice cracked. "I wanted to leave him. I told him I was transferring most of my assets into a foundation. A charity. Money he couldn't control." Margaret whispered, horrified, "She told me that last month." Victoria's eyes fluttered open again, staring directly at Greg. "You said you loved me. But the moment you realized you couldn't own me, you decided to bury me." Greg's face twisted with rage and desperation. "Do you hear yourself? You're raving. You were sick. You were dying. I was grieving. You were pretending," Victoria said. Her voice strengthened with a mix of bitterness and clarity. "I trusted you. I trusted you with everything, and you planned to bury me alive." Dr. Pierce stepped forward, sweating profusely. "This is getting out of hand. Mrs. Hale, toxins can distort memories." "Toxins you administered," I cut in sharply. He flinched. The crowd turned toward him. Phones rose again, recording. Dr. Pierce stuttered, I followed protocol. Protocol doesn't include pronouncing someone dead without checking for toxin-induced paralysis," I said. Protocol doesn't include rushing a burial within 24 hours. Protocol doesn't include running when a woman breathes again. The doctor's jaw clenched. "You don't understand the complexities." "I understand desperation," I said quietly, "and guilt." Greg lunged suddenly, screaming, "Shut up! You don't know anything." The guards slammed him back down. His voice cracked raw and unhinged. "She loved her money more than me. More than us. She was going to take everything. I did what I had to do." The tent dissolved into shouts. Margaret gasped as if struck. Reporters nearly tripped over one another, capturing every word. Dr. Pierce backed away, whispering, "Greg, stop." But Greg couldn't. His confession poured out like poison. "I gave you everything," he screamed at Victoria. "I stood by you while you built your empire. I deserved something in return. I deserved to matter." Victoria stared at him, more heartbreak than anger in her eyes. "You mattered," she whispered. "You mattered more than the world, and you chose this." Greg shook violently, head dropping as if weight finally crushed him. "You wouldn't listen," he sobbed. "You never listened." Margaret stepped protectively closer to Victoria. "And your solution," she said slowly, "was murder." "It wasn't supposed to be murder," Greg spat. "She was supposed to die quietly in her sleep. Pierce said the dose would stop her heart." The collective gasp nearly shook the tent poles. Dr. Pierce stumbled backward again, hands trembling. I was coerced," he said desperately. "He threatened me. He said he'd end my career, expose my debts." "You signed her death certificate," I said. "You helped bury a living woman." "I didn't know she was alive," he cried. "I swear I didn't," but guilt dripped from every word like oil. Victoria drew a ragged breath. "I trusted both of you," she whispered. "And you nearly ended my life?" Greg screamed again, thrashing so wildly the guards had to force him face down into the grass. "You don't deserve your money," he raged. "You don't deserve anything." The tent broke into chaos, but I tuned it out, focused solely on Victoria. Her breaths were shallow but stronger, her skin warming, her heartbeat visible in the faint pulse at her throat. Alive. Truly alive, and the truth surrounding her every betrayal, every lie, every deadly intention had finally broken open for the world to see. She looked at me again, tears filling her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for hearing me when no one else would." I swallowed hard. No one deserves to be buried before their story is finished. Even after Greg had been dragged out of the funeral tent, even after Dr. Pierce stood trembling under the weight of his own unraveling lies, even after the mourners had transformed from silent observers into horrified witnesses of a crime, my focus stayed fixed on Victoria. Her breaths were still shallow. Her eyelids fluttered like they were fighting gravity just to stay open. Every few seconds her fingers twitched as if her body was slowly remembering what it meant to be alive. Yet, beneath the relief, beneath the shock of seeing a woman brought back from the edge of death, something heavier pulled at me. A weight I had carried for so long that I no longer knew where it ended, and I began. When the medics finally arrived, pushing through the crowd with equipment in hand, I stepped back, but not far. I hovered close enough to intervene if they did something wrong, close enough that Margaret reached out almost instinctively and grabbed my arm. "Stay with her," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Please." I nodded without hesitation. I didn't know why she trusted me so quickly, or why she looked at me like I was the only solid ground in a collapsing world. Part of me felt unworthy of it. Another part of me, a part I had tried to bury, felt seen for the first time in years. While the medics checked vital signs and loaded Victoria onto a stretcher, Margaret's grip tightened on my sleeve. "How did you know?" she asked quietly. "How could you tell she wasn't gone?" I looked at the stretcher as they prepared to move it. "Because I've seen someone die," I said. "And I've seen someone still fighting when everyone else believed it was over." Her brows furrowed gently. "Who?" The stretcher began rolling, and I followed beside it. My voice felt like it was being pulled from somewhere deep and rusted shut. A place I had locked away and prayed would stay sealed. "My daughter," I said. The world seemed to hush again. Margaret slowed her steps, eyes soft with understanding she didn't yet have. What happened? I hadn't spoken about it in more than a year. The memory alone had the power to crush my ribs from the inside, but the words came anyway. "There was an engine fire," I said. "A small commuter plane. She and my wife were on it. We were on vacation, and I had been working in aviation safety for almost a decade at that point. I knew every protocol, every possible sequence of failure." My throat tightened. "But knowing doesn't matter when you can't reach the people you love." Margaret's eyes glistened. The medics slowed at the uneven stone path, giving me a moment to breathe, but the air felt sharp. When the cabin filled with smoke, I continued. I found her through a cracked section of fuselage. She was pinned. She couldn't move. Her eyes... My voice faltered. Her eyes were still searching for me even when her body was shutting down. I swallowed hard, the memory slicing through years of suppressed grief. And she was breathing. Faintly, but breathing. No one else could hear it. No one wanted to. They thought I was in denial. They tried to pull me back. But I knew what I heard. Margaret placed a trembling hand over mine. I didn't pull away. I stayed with her, I whispered. Held her hand as long as I could. Listened to every breath until there were no more. And when the rescue team finally got to her, they said she had been gone for minutes. But I knew the exact moment she left. My voice cracked, because I listened. Margaret's tears spilled freely. "I'm so sorry," she breathed. No one should carry that kind of loss. I looked toward Victoria again. "When you've heard someone take their last breath," I said quietly, "you never forget what life sounds like, even the faintest whisper of it." The medics reached the ambulance and carefully lifted the stretcher inside. Victoria's head shifted just enough that her eyes opened again. Weak, unfocused, but undeniably alive. When she saw me standing there, something like relief flickered across her expression. She reached out her hand, barely moving it, a soft, searching gesture. I stepped closer, placing my hand lightly over hers. Her skin was warm now, warmer than before. A sign her body was fighting its way back. "You stayed," she whispered, voice paper-thin. "I told you," I said softly. "I'm right here." Her eyes fluttered, exhaustion pulling her under again. But before she drifted, she breathed out a single word. Why, I felt Margaret's gaze on me. I felt the cold air press against my back. I felt the memory of smoke, of burning metal, of a child's breath fading into silence. Because I whispered, "I know what it feels like to lose someone when you still hear them fighting, and I will never walk away from that again." The medics closed the ambulance doors, but not before giving me an unexpected nod, as if they too sensed my purpose there. Margaret touched my shoulder. "Come with us," she said. "Victoria will want to see you when she wakes." I blinked at her, stunned. "I'm just a maintenance worker." "No," she said, voice steady with truth. "You're the man who saved her life." The ambulance pulled away, lights flashing silently because the sirens felt too violent for something this sacred. I stood there watching until it disappeared around the bend. The tent behind me buzzed with reporters, police questioning witnesses, guards securing the area, and the fragmented remains of Greg's unraveling life. But none of it mattered. For the first time in years, something inside me shifted. Light. Thin, but real. The world had taken everything from me once. Today, it felt like it had given back a piece of purpose, maybe even redemption. And as I turned to follow the ambulance toward the hospital, one truth echoed in my chest like a heartbeat finally waking. I couldn't save my daughter, but today I saved someone else's, and that was enough to keep me breathing. The trial was scheduled 6 weeks after the funeral incident, but the media storm began long before any judge ever touched the case file. For days, every major news network replayed the footage from the funeral tent, Greg screaming as he was restrained, Dr. Pierce stumbling through contradictory statements, Margaret shielding Victoria's body with trembling hands, and me, someone the world had ignored for years, standing between a living woman and the grave, meant to swallow her. Headlines called it the burial plot case. Others called it the Boston Resurrection. Either way, the world was watching by the time I stepped into the courthouse. The building itself loomed like a monument to human failure and redemption. Its stone pillars stretched high, casting long shadows across the marble steps. Reporters lined the entrance, calling my name as though I were someone important. A few months ago, no one would have recognized me. Now, microphones pointed toward me like weapons and lifelines all at once. Elias, did you really hear her breathe? Did you know Greg Hale personally? Were you aware of any marital conflict before the incident? Are you aware that some consider you a hero? Margaret waited beside me as we entered. You don't owe them answers, she whispered. I nodded. The truth was I didn't have many answers anyway. All I had was what I heard, what I saw, and what I refused to ignore. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt charged, humming with anticipation. Spectators filled every bench. Lawyers whispered to clients. The air smelled faintly of paperwood polish and tension. When Victoria entered, supported gently by a medical aide, the entire room rose. She looked far stronger than the day we saved her, but still carried the delicate fragility of someone whose soul had brushed the edge of nothingness. When she reached her seat beside the prosecution, her eyes briefly searched the room until they found me. She nodded softly. I felt something steady inside me, something I thought had died the night I lost my daughter. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Helena Brooks, took the bench. Her presence alone commanded silence. Court is now in session, she said. The Commonwealth versus Gregory Hale and Dr. Alan Pierce. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecution painted a picture of greed, betrayal, and a calculated attempt to bury a woman alive before she could file for divorce and redirect the bulk of her fortune. The defense claimed Greg had acted out of grief, that Pierce had made an honest medical error, and that my intervention was nothing more than a traumatized man misinterpreting a tragic situation. The first witness called was Margaret. She spoke with a combination of grace and fury, recounting the events at the funeral tent and revealing the conversation she had shared with Victoria in the weeks leading up to her death. For the first time, the courtroom heard how deeply Victoria feared Greg's controlling behavior, how carefully she planned her separation, and how she feared the consequences once Greg realized he would lose control of her wealth. Then came the recorded audio. A voicemail Victoria had left Margaret 2 nights before her collapse. If anything happens to me, her voice whispered through the speakers. Don't trust Greg. Don't trust my doctor. Something feels wrong. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Greg shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. Dr. Pierce looked like he wanted to melt into the floorboards. When the prosecution finally called me to the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. I walked slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. The bailiff swore me in. I sat. The prosecutor approached. Mr. Rhoda Rowan, please describe what you witnessed on the morning of Mrs. Hale's funeral. I took a breath. I heard her breathe. And how did you know it wasn't a hallucination or a misinterpretation of ambient sound? The prosecutor asked. Because I've heard last breaths before I said. The courtroom quieted further. I know what death sounds like. I know what life sounds like. And that was life. The prosecutor nodded. What else did you observe? Her skin color, I answered. Her warmth. The scratches on her nails. The slight movement of her chest. The moisture at the corner of her eye. Signs a body doesn't show after death. Whispered murmurs filled the room. Greg shifted violently in his chair. Dr. Pierce wiped sweat from his brow. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, a smirk plastered across his face. Mr. Rowan, he began, you've suffered significant trauma in your life, correct? A ripple of discomfort moved through the spectators. I met his gaze. You lost your daughter in a tragic accident. And your wife left afterward. Would you say that grief may have impaired your judgment on the day of the funeral? I inhaled slowly. Grief doesn't change facts, I said. Her chest moved. Her breath was audible. Her warmth was real. Trauma didn't create those signs. It just made me pay attention. A murmur of agreement swept through the audience. The defense attorney stiffened. So you're saying you, a cemetery maintenance worker, somehow knew more than a licensed physician? No, I said. I'm saying I listened harder than he did. A few people gasped. Even the judge's stern expression softened slightly. When Victoria was called next, every person in the courtroom leaned forward. She walked slowly to the witness stand, each step deliberate, each breath measured. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but unwavering. I remember the taste of the drug, she said. I remember my limbs going numb. I remember trying to scream. I remember hearing Greg tell Alan to sign the paperwork quickly. Greg jumped to his feet. She's lying, he shouted. The judge banged her gavel. Sit down, Mr. Hale. But Greg didn't sit. His face twisted into a grotesque contortion of rage and desperation. She was going to ruin me. You don't understand. She was leaving me for her money, not for love. He lunged forward, only to be grabbed by two guards. She deserved it. She deserved. The rest of his words were lost under the uproar. The judge slammed the gavel again and again until the room finally went silent. When order resumed, Dr. Pierce had dissolved into tears. I'm sorry, he sobbed. I never meant for it to go this far. He forced me. He threatened everything I had. The judge stared at him with cold condemnation. You betrayed your oath. Her verdict came swiftly. Greg Hale, life imprisonment without parole. Dr. Alan Pierce, life imprisonment for attempted murder and conspiracy. When the trial adjourned, Victoria stood steady despite her trembling. She approached me slowly, her eyes bright with gratitude and something deeper. You saved my life. Twice, she whispered. Once when you heard me, and once when you told the world. My throat tightened. I simply nodded. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. People shouted my name. They called me a hero, but I didn't feel like one. Not then, not yet. But as Victoria slipped her hand into mine, a gesture of connection, recognition, survival, I felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Something warm. Something whole. Maybe this was what it felt like to return to the living. The weeks following the trial unfolded with a strange mixture of quiet and awakening, as if life itself was unsure how to resume after brushing so closely against death. The world had watched the courtroom drama with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for movies, but once the sentences were handed down, the public's attention shifted to their next spectacle. Yet, for Victoria and me, the echo of that near burial lingered everywhere. She was discharged from the hospital 13 days after the verdict. Her body still carried the fragility of someone who had survived a chemical assault and days of immobility, but her spirit, though shaken, looked sharper than before, as if almost dying had carved away the illusions she once lived under. She invited me to her estate the following week. It sat on the outskirts of Boston, surrounded by whispering sycamore trees that looked older than the city itself. I hesitated before accepting. I wasn't sure what place a cemetery maintenance worker had in the restored life of a billionaire. But Margaret insisted. "You're part of this family now," she said, "whether you understand it yet or not." When I arrived, the house staff was waiting, not with the forced politeness wealthy homes often exude, but with genuine warmth. They greeted me by name. One of them even said, "We're glad you're here, sir," as if I belonged. I stepped inside expecting marble chandeliers, cold luxury. Instead, the home felt surprisingly lived in soft light, warm wood shelves full of books, art that actually meant something. Victoria waited in a sunroom overlooking a winter bare garden. She looked smaller in the oversized armchair, but brighter somehow, like someone rebuilding herself piece by piece. She smiled when she saw me. "You came," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," I admitted. She patted the chair beside her. "Sit, I want to show you something." On the table lay a stack of documents, plans, proposals, sketches. "This," she said, placing a hand on top, "is what Greg feared. The Hale Foundation. I wanted to create a division dedicated to aviation safety reform and emergency response innovation." The breath caught in my chest. Aviation safety. "Yes," she said softly. "After what happened to your daughter, after everything you told me, I realized there's so much more that could be done, and I want you to lead it." The world seemed to tilt. "Victoria, I don't have the credentials anymore. I'm just—" "Don't," she cut in. "You are not just anything. You're the reason I'm alive. And more importantly, you're someone who understands life and death moments better than most people ever will." I shook my head slowly. "I don't know if I can go back to that world." She studied me, her gaze gentle but unwavering. "Maybe it's not about going back," she said. "Maybe it's about going forward carrying what you've survived." I didn't answer right away, but her words lodged in a place within me that had long been silent. In the days that followed, I visited the Hale estate often. Sometimes we discussed the foundation. Sometimes we simply sat quietly letting the winter sunlight stretch through the room, while the weight of everything we'd endured settled into manageable corners of our minds. Her daughter Lily, 9 years old, bright-eyed, curious, took to me quickly. She would wander into our meetings asking questions about airplanes, engines, safety, protocols. The first time she slipped her small hand into mine, something in my chest cracked open. A warmth I hadn't felt since my daughter's laughter once filled my life returned in a quiet, fragile way. One evening, as Victoria watched Lily showing me her drawings, she whispered, "She likes you." "Maybe because she senses kindness. Kids are good at that," I said softly. "Better than adults." "She also lost someone," Victoria added. "Her father may be alive, but she lost him long before the trial. She sees what she's missing in you." The words settled heavy and tender between us. I'm not trying to replace anyone, I said. I know, she answered, and maybe that's why she trusts you. Weeks passed. My role shifted from visitor to partner in the Foundation's early planning. I sat in boardrooms I never imagined entering. I helped design protocols for emergency medical response and survival assessments. The board listened when I spoke. They wrote down my ideas. They valued my experience not despite my past, but because of it. Slowly, the shadows that had followed me since the plane fire faded, replaced by something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. One night after a long meeting, Victoria and I walked through the quiet garden. The frost shimmered in the moonlight. "Do you ever think about how close we came?" she asked. "Every day," I replied. "Me too," she whispered. "And every day I'm reminded that the reason I'm here is because someone cared enough to listen." She stopped, turning toward me. "You didn't save my life once, Elias. You've been saving it every day since." I felt the cold air sting my eyes. "You helped save mine too," I said. Her smile was small, genuine. "Then maybe we can keep saving each other." We stood there a while, breathing in the quiet. Two damaged people learning slowly how to live again. 2 years passed, not in a blur, but in a slow rebuilding that felt almost like learning to breathe again after spending too long underwater. Boston shifted through seasons around us, the city lighting up and dimming storms coming and going while our lives quietly rewove themselves into something neither of us could have predicted the day I stopped a funeral with nothing but instinct and desperation. Victoria healed in stages, some visible, some invisible. The physical recovery came first. The emotional one took longer, but she faced both with a strength that surprised even her. As for me, I found my place within the Hale Foundation becoming more defined each month. The Phoenix Initiative. Our program dedicated to aviation and crisis survival expanded faster than any of us imagined. Schools requested training. Airports requested consultations. Survivors sent letters saying our protocols had saved lives. The first time a father wrote, "Because of your program, my daughter is still alive." I found myself sitting alone in my apartment, tears falling before I even understood why. Maybe it was grief, maybe healing, maybe both. Life did not return to what it once was. It became something new. On a crisp autumn morning, during a conference in Chicago, Victoria, and I stood backstage watching the audience settle. Major news networks were present. Government officials, too. The Phoenix Initiative was receiving a national recognition award. "You nervous?" she asked. Terrified, I admitted. "Good," she smiled. "Means you care." When my name was called and applause erupted, I felt something unfamiliar return to me. Not pride exactly, but belonging. Afterward, during the flight home, Victoria gazed out the window as clouds drifted below. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think the worst thing that ever happened to me was almost dying, and now, I think the worst thing would have been never waking up to see what came after." She turned toward me, her expression gentler than I'd ever seen. "You were part of that, after, Elias." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't speak, but the warmth in her eyes stayed with me long after the plane descended. Months later, on a winter evening, when the city lights shimmered like scattered stars, I had dinner at her home. Lily, now 11, had grown taller, her curls bouncing around her face as she ran to greet me. "I got an A on my science project," she announced. "Because Mr. Rowan helped me test wind resistance with the little model plane." She did all the work, I said, smiling. Victoria looked at me from across the room, quiet, appreciative. After dinner, when Lily went upstairs, we sat in the soft glow of the fireplace. The flames reflected in her eyes, golden and calm. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said. "Business partner, I guessed. Something like that." She hesitated, searching for words. "His name is Nathan Cole. He's kind, thoughtful, been in my life the past few months." I felt an unexpected stillness settle inside me. Not jealousy, not disappointment. Something gentler. A shift. "I'm glad," I said honestly. "You deserve someone good." She exhaled in quiet relief. "I was afraid you might, I don't know, feel that I was replacing something." "I'm not something to be replaced," I said with a small laugh. "Neither are you." Her smile deepened, softening her features. "Nathan isn't trying to fill a void. He's just helping me build the life I almost lost." I nodded. "That's all anyone can ask for." A few weeks later, she introduced us at a charity event. Nathan was warm, genuine, without the insecurities Greg used to hide behind arrogance. They fit together, naturally. And I understood without bitterness that whatever bond Victoria and I shared was not meant to become romance. It was meant to become something steadier, something foundational. One spring afternoon, the Hale Foundation celebrated its annual Lives Saved Day near the harbor. Survivors stood on stage giving testimonials. People hugged, people cried. People thanked us for giving them another sunrise. When the event ended, Victoria walked toward me through the crowd. The wind caught her hair, and for a moment she looked almost like that woman in the coffin again, except this time she was impossibly alive. "You know," she said quietly, "you weren't just the man who stopped my burial." She paused, her voice warm. "You were the man who made sure life didn't bury itself afterward." I swallowed the tightness in my throat. "We all come back to life," I said, "when someone believes in us." She reached out and squeezed my hand. Not romantically, not out of obligation, but with deep, unwavering gratitude. And in that small gesture everything made sense. The new beginnings, the healed wounds, the paths diverging yet still running parallel. The truth was simple. She didn't belong to me, and I didn't belong to her. But our survival did. Together. As the sun dipped toward the Boston skyline, casting long golden streaks over the water, I realized something profound. I had spent years believing my life ended the day the fire took my daughter, but life had been waiting for me. Patiently, quietly, until the moment I refused to walk away from a funeral. And in saving someone else's tomorrow, I had finally reclaimed my own. There are moments in a man's life that divide everything into before and after lines drawn so sharply they feel like wounds. I used to believe my defining moment was the night I lost my daughter in that fire, the night I stood helpless as the world I loved collapsed into flames. For years, every breath that followed felt borrowed, every sunrise undeserved. I walked through life like a ghost trapped in a body, existing only because dying felt cowardly. But now, standing on the quiet hill overlooking Ravenwood Hill Cemetery, watching the late afternoon sun spill over the marble headstones and the restless branches of the sycamore trees, I realized the truth. My defining moment wasn't the night I lost everything. It was the morning I chose not to walk away. The morning I heard a breath no one else heard. The morning I trusted an instinct everyone insisted was madness. The morning I stepped into a funeral and said the words no one expected. "She's not dead." That decision didn't just save Victoria Hale. It saved me. I ran my hand over the cool stone railing as the wind lifted, carrying the familiar scent of cut grass and distant pine. Ravenwood had once been the place where I hid from the world, where anonymity felt like shelter. Today, it felt different. Not a hiding place. A place where endings and beginnings quietly shook hands. Behind me, footsteps approached, soft but certain. I didn't need to turn to know it was Victoria. "I thought I'd find you here," she said gently. "You always come back to the places that almost broke you." I smiled faintly. "Maybe because they don't hold the same power they used to." She stepped beside me, her gaze sweeping across the cemetery. "It's peaceful," she murmured. "In a strange way. It used to scare me," I admitted. "Not because of death, but because I felt like I belonged here more than anywhere else." She looked at me, then, her voice quiet but firm. "Not anymore." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The breeze whispered between us, carrying the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of traffic from the city, life moving as it always does. "Do you ever think about it?" she finally asked. "About that day?" "Every day," I said, "but not the way I used to. How do you think about it now?" I let the silence stretch, searching for words that felt true. "I think about what would have happened if I hadn't spoken up, if I'd convinced myself it wasn't my place, if I'd walked away like everyone expected." She exhaled softly. "Then I wouldn't be here." "And I wouldn't either," I answered. "Not really. Not the version of me that exists now." She rested a hand lightly on the railing. "I used to think survival was a solitary thing," she said. "You claw your way out of darkness alone." But I was wrong. We survived because someone reached back. Her words struck something deep inside me, a place where grief and healing had long been entangled. "I didn't reach back," I said quietly. "I reached forward, toward something I didn't understand yet." She smiled at that, the kind of smile that carried history. Maybe that's how all beginnings start. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in orange and lavender. A soft fading light, the kind that makes the world feel paused between what was and what could be. "Victoria," I said suddenly, surprising even myself. "Do you think people ever truly get second chances?" She turned toward me, her expression thoughtful. "I don't think life hands them out," she said. "I think we make them, by choosing differently, by refusing to let the past keep its hands around our throats." I nodded slowly. Maybe saving someone else's life was the only way to save my own. Maybe she whispered it was the way you forgave yourself. The wind shifted again, and for a moment it felt like the world inhaled with us releasing something heavy into the open air. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and looked at me in that steady, unwavering way she had when she wanted her words to land. "Elias," she said softly, "no matter where our lives go next, I want you to remember one thing." "What's that?" "You didn't just stop my funeral. You stopped my life from ending in every way that mattered." My chest tightened, not painfully, but with a kind of warmth that felt earned. "And you reminded me. I said that some lives are worth stepping into the fire for." She laughed gently. "You always did have a dramatic streak." "Occupational hazard," I said. "Working in cemeteries does that to a man." She nudged my arm lightly. "You know, I think this is the first time we've stood here without tragedy hanging over us." I nodded. "It won't be the last," and I believed it. For the first time in years, I believed in tomorrows that didn't hurt. She slipped her hands into her coat pockets, glancing toward the path leading back to the gates. "Come on," she said. "They're waiting for us at the foundation dinner. And if you're late again, Margaret will have your head." "Wouldn't be the first time," I murmured. She laughed, and the sound echoed softly through the rows of headstones. An impossible sound, a beautiful sound, proof that the dead don't get the final say. Not always. I cast one last look at the hill, at the shadows stretching long and gentle over the graves. Then I turned toward the living, toward the woman whose life had intertwined with mine in the most unlikely way, toward the future that neither of us could have imagined. We walked side by side, leaving the quiet of Ravenwood behind as the sky faded into the pale glow of dusk. And for the first time I understood a truth I wish I had known years earlier. Life doesn't return to us in a single moment. It returns in pieces, in breaths, in choices, in the courage to say, "She's not dead even when the world calls you crazy," and in the courage to believe that sometimes neither are we. If you've stayed with me until the end of this journey, thank you. Stories like this aren't just about life and death, they're about listening to the quiet instinct inside us, the one that tells us to act when everyone else looks away. Victoria's life was saved by a single moment of courage. But the truth is that the courage lives in all of us. Maybe your moment isn't stopping a burial or exposing a crime. Maybe it's checking on a neighbor who seems alone, calling someone you haven't spoken to in years, or choosing to believe that healing is still possible even after everything feels lost. We all carry battles no one sees. We all stand on the edge of our own graves, sometimes buried by grief, by regret, by the weight of yesterday. But, like Victoria, like me, you can rise again. You deserve to rise again. So, if this story touched you, share your own moment of courage or kindness in the comments. Tell us who saved you, or who you wish you could have saved. And if you believe in second chances and redemption and in the light that still waits for all of us, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next story. You're never alone. Not here.